welcome back to the Zodcast. This is going to be episode number 12. And as someone else in Texas likes to say, all right, let's just jump right into it. And from the mailbag from the last episode, I wanted to mention Kenneth, who goes under Fan Dan Van in the comment section. And Kenneth brought up something that I had heard before, but I'm glad he brought it up again, because in the last episode, number 11, we were talking about Don Chaney's handwriting and some of the other things we found that were so similar to the Zodiac's handwriting. But as Kenneth brought up, he said that he saw a video on this. I think I heard a podcast on it. It might have even been Monster, where they had a handwriting expert, and this is what Kenneth was saying as well. But that even more rare is having handwriting that looks similar to the Zodiac's. The most rare thing about the writing was how the Zodiac would separate two-syllable words. As for instance, Chaney does this with the word connecting in a letter he sent to Tom Voigt. And there's several other examples where the Zodiac does this. And I think as far as the only handwriting sample we have from Chaney was that letter to Tom Voigt in 2001. And I did, if Kenneth, you can remember where you saw that video, please put it in the comments section of this video if you can, and I'll try to see where I found that as well. But I can remember this handwriting expert saying that is far more unusual than any having similarities in the way the actual letters are shaped. It's much more rare to do what the Zodiac was doing and what Don does with that word connectivity when he's talking about the dialysis machine and Arthur Lee Allen in that letter that Don sent to Tom Voigt, which is obviously on Tom Voigt's site, zodiackiller.com. But anyway, thanks to Brandon and David for buying the book. If you guys can, please review it. And if you're lucky enough to catch this episode in the next probably 2 hours after I upload it, I'm going to be doing a show with Jerome with the French Wrecking Crew, and that's going to be a YouTube live show, and I'm going to put the link for that in this video. So after I upload this, it might only be about an hour and a half before that show starts, because I wasn't exactly sure what time. But if you don't catch the live one, it'll be on his channel even after the live show is done, so check that out. And you'll see in my photos section at the beginning of this Zodcast a picture of the Zodiac Killer channel, and that is as a reminder that episode 3 of Obsession in the Darkness is coming out soon. It's been delayed, but good things come to those who wait, and that's going to be really good. Ned from Black Box Online Radio is the narrator in that, and then I have a cameo. I'm in there reading the police reports, so that's going to be a really good video. So definitely be on the lookout for that over on the Zodiac Killer channel, and remember to subscribe to that channel as well as Black Box Online Radio. I know a lot of you guys already do subscribe to Ned's channel over there, but everything's good on that, and he looks at a lot of different suspects, and obviously I'm pretty much focused on Don, but I probably will do something pretty soon talking about all the different suspects as well. And I also had a picture of Sherry Jo Bates in the photos section. That was because I intended to upload this episode closer to the anniversary of her murder, which was, of course, October 30th of 1966. So this past day before Halloween, I was trying to get that up. So that's why Sherry Jo Bates is there. And also there's a picture of Ralph Spinelli. That's the one I had mentioned a couple episodes ago, where you can tell how stocky he looks in his face and everything. He was a football player at Vallejo High School. It's so hard to believe that story about Arthur Lee Allen blowing open the door or whatever and this brawl happening. Spinelli doesn't look like he's going to let too much get over on him. And I think Arthur Lee Allen was a bigger guy, but he's basically a wimp. He's one of these bully types that never actually fights anybody. It's my opinion. And it looks like Spinelli could handle himself. So that whole thing is just a strange story. If you go back to that whole story that Spinelli tells in the documentary, his name was Arthur Lee Allen. So in this episode, I am taking the suggestion of Professor Stewart, who wanted me to take a deeper dive into the interview given by Don Chaney to Tom Voigt that happened on December 30th, 2000. This was an in-person interview. We've talked about it before on this channel. And that happened at the Hood River Inn in Hood River, Oregon. And I know somebody made the comment, too, on the last video in the comment section about it was interesting that Don Chaney drove 4 hours to get to this interview, and I think Tom Voigt had mentioned that. That's in another part on Tom's site, ZodiacKiller.com, because I remember that's one of the ways we know how tall Don Chaney is, because when Tom Voight met him for this interview, he remarked that he was about 6 feet tall, because I don't have a copy of Don Chaney's driver's license. I'd love to have it, especially from 1969. We do have Arthur Lee Allen's, of course, but it would be interesting to see Don's. But you could kind of tell, you can see how stocky Don was. I have lots of pictures of him, but that is one of the only reports of his height where Tom Voight, just judging by his own height, thought Don Chaney was about 6 feet tall. So that's interesting. So someone did leave a comment about how it was interesting that Don Chaney drove 4 hours to meet Tom Voight for this interview. And I think Tom Voight wrote that in another note there on his website about this interview he had with Chaney back in 2000. And I don't know if that's right, because I think at the time Don Chaney was living in Benton City, Washington. So I just mapped out how far Benton City, Washington was to Hood River, Oregon, and it's about a 2.5 hour drive, which is still a pretty good drive. Nothing near what it would have been if Chaney was, leaving Pomona to drive up to do the murders in the Bay Area, but still a pretty good drive. I'm sure Tom bought his lunch or whatever they had there, but didn't give him any money. So it's interesting, obviously Don was retired, living up there, so that wasn't that big of a deal. But before I get into some of these things in this interview that we haven't mentioned before, I want to just look over the things you have to think about with this whole connection of Don Chaney and Arthur Lee Allen and the Zodiac murders. Now, there's only 3 or 4 total possibilities here. If Don Chaney was not the Zodiac killer, then the most likely thing was that him and Arthur Lee Allen teamed up to take credit for the murders. Now, if that were the case, it's a really big stretch to consider the fact that the Zodiac killer, no one knew what he was going to call himself until late July of 1969. And by Don's own admission, he said he never talked to Arthur Lee Allen again after that New Year's Day of 1969. So we do know for an absolute, undisputed fact that Arthur Lee Allen got a Zodiac wristwatch along with his younger brother for Christmas of 1967. So what are the odds that they sat around planning on taking credit for this stuff? Even, let's just say that was on New Year's Day of 1969, and the Zodiac killer, totally unrelated to Don Chaney and Arthur Lee Allen, comes out and calls himself the Zodiac killer, employing both the cross circle logo and the name Zodiac, which almost in history of time never go together other than that wristwatch. And it just so happened that Arthur Lee Allen already had one. So it just goes to show you that that plausibility is very remote, that these two guys just got together and said, hey, wouldn't it be funny to take credit for these murders, or just jerk the cops around and throw some suspicion on them. It just doesn't, it makes absolutely no sense. And another thing that we know about Arthur Lee Allen that was confirmed by his brother, his sister-in-law, and even the police, was that Arthur Lee Allen liked to misspell words for comedic effect. The police even found a note on one of the search warrants before they'd even heard this before, that it was a grocery list, and Arthur Lee Allen wrote eggs, A-I-G-S, for eggs. So this is something everyone knew that he did. It wasn't something they made up later to add on to evidence. It's something he did. So it was very interesting when the Zodiac letters came out and there was words intentionally misspelled. Because if you look at the Zodiac killer letters, you'll see where he'll spell something right in one letter and spell it, wrong in another. He could obviously spell. So this was just something to throw off law enforcement, or maybe Don trying to put just a little more shade onto Arthur Lee Allen. We don't know. But you also see in one of the Zodiac letters the phrase trigger mech. And Karen Allen, Arthur Lee Allen's sister-in-law, said that's a phrase, a shortened phrase that Arthur Lee Allen liked to use. And she remembered him using the phrase trigger mech for trigger mechanism. So what are the odds that these two guys sat around just wanting to take credit for this stuff and jerking the cops around, that Arthur Lee Allen gets questioned shortly after 2 weeks after the Lake Berryessa attack in September, and these things just happen to come out with the Zodiac killer misspelling words, using the name Zodiac killer in the logo, and Allen having to watch. It's just an impossibility. And then the other thing you have to consider is maybe this is just Chaney getting revenge for this molestation attempt on Chaney's daughter that Chaney talked about fairly often. At the time around where it happened, he did say something to Ron Allen, Arthur Lee Allen's younger brother, and Arthur Lee Allen's sister-in-law, Ron's wife, Karen. And they remembered that. I think this is all Don Chaney's planning. He's just that smart to say that this happened. So I'll talk about that a little bit more when Chaney brings it up in this interview. But what's interesting about that whole angle is Don never seemed to make a big deal of it. He said that Allen touched his daughter's bottom. She was 3 years old at the time. Arthur Lee Allen never had any history of going after any children as young as 3. I mean, he's a sick guy, but there was no history of it at all, which is, kind of a stretch there for him doing it. Also, as an adult, Tom Voigt interviewed Don Chaney's daughter, who said it never happened. And I'm sure her mother would have told her. She was very close to her mother, lived near her mother in Connecticut. And I'm pretty sure her mom would have said, yeah, it happened. He touched her bottom, but that's history. It's all behind us. So why, as an adult, would she lie about that incident and saying that it never happened? It just doesn't make sense. And then, of course, Don Chaney never went to the police over it. So we're to believe by some people on the internet that Don Chaney is framing Arthur Lee Allen for this molestation attempt, and he also, Chaney says, that this attempt happened in 1967 when his daughter was roughly 3 years old, because she was born in late 1963. And so Chaney's going to wait until July of 1971 to start his master plan of getting revenge against Arthur Lee Allen for this touching his daughter's bottom. I mean, that's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. It just doesn't hold water. And then the other thing that you would have to throw out there, that Don Chaney's telling the truth about Arthur Lee Allen. Well, that doesn't make sense either, because if he is telling the truth, there's no reason why Don Chaney's story has changed multiple times. And as I've talked about so much, why did he change his original timeline from when Arthur Lee Allen told him all this stuff about how he was going to be the Zodiac killer and murder these couples on Lover's Lane? Why did Don Chaney change that story from happening on New Year's Day 1968 to 1969? That's because that was one of the few mistakes Don Chaney made, because he didn't realize that in 1968, on that New Year's Day, that Arthur Lee Allen had not yet been fired from teaching at Valley Springs. So that kind of screwed up his whole timeline, so he had to move it forward 1 year. So again, if he's telling the truth about Arthur Lee Allen, and I agree with Robert Graysmith on this as well, if you believe Don Chaney, then you have to believe that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac killer. I do agree with him on that, except for Don Chaney is not being truthful, because he's changed his story and had made some outright lies. So those are the scenarios you're looking at. Either these two guys made it up, or Chaney made it up on his own, and it just so happened the guy he was going to blame owned a Zodiac watch in 67, and all these other little things you can tie to Allen. And it's the only way you can explain how Arthur Lee Allen, till this day, even in Zodiac message board groups, where so many people will go, ballistic if you even mention that you think it's Arthur Lee Allen. No, it can't be him because of X, Y, and Z. Well, why is it always still being brought up? Because the circumstantial evidence against Arthur Lee Allen is so strong, at least half of it. So a Don Chaney-Arthur Lee Allen tandem is the only reasonable explanation for these murders in so many ways. So anyway, that being said, that's kind of little, I know a lot of you guys already know all that, but it's just a little preface for going back through this interview with Don and Tom Voigt. So anyway, the interview starts out. Tom Voigt says, okay, so it's December 30th, 2000, and it's 1 p.m. at the Hood River in Hood River, Oregon. Go ahead and say your name. Don says, Don Chaney. Tom Voigt, Don Chaney, I'm Tom Voigt, and I guess we should probably talk about Arthur Lee Allen, don't you think? Don, might as well, but never heard anybody call him Arthur. So here's Don Chaney already being kind of weird and combative or whatever. And Tom Voigt says, yeah, that's, I've been trying to, every time there's a newspaper story about him or something, I always tell them, look, don't call him Arthur, because nobody will recognize him as Arthur, and you'll lose out on some feedback from people. And they always say, okay, we won't call him Arthur. And then, of course, they always call him Arthur, so I wonder how many people with some good information have read stories about him and they didn't realize who it was. It's crazy. So, but he spelled it Lee, L-E-E sometimes, I guess. And Don Chaney says, I'm not aware of that. So he kind of starts out weird. And then Tom just goes back through, asking him some basics about this. And of course, this interview is about Arthur Lee Allen. It's not about Don Chaney. Remember, anyone had never suspected Don Chaney until he said he licked Arthur Lee Allen's stamps, and after he sent that written letter to Tom Voigt that happened after this interview. So even Tom Voigt is not suspicious with Don Chaney hardly at all. Maybe he is a little bit, but he never leads on. And this whole interview is about just questioning him about him accusing Arthur Lee Allen. Of course, remember, Arthur Lee Allen has been dead for about 8 years before this interview as well. So going again with that revenge angle with the daughter, Allen's been dead now for 8 years. So if that was Cheney's whole goal in getting back at Allen, now that he's dead for 8 years, he still seems to be enjoying this stuff because he drove at least 2.5 hours to meet Tom Voigt for a cup of coffee and maybe a free lunch to still talk about this case. So that's another thing that goes against this whole revenge for the bottom touching incident, we'll call it. So this is something else to keep in mind. So Tom says, where did you meet Lee? And Don says, I met him at Cal Poly in 1962. Of course, that's where Don Cheney was being educated to be a mechanical engineer. And then here's what Don says. Tom says, what was he doing at the time? Meaning Allen. And Don says, well, he was unemployed and he had spent some time in Riverside taking a race car driving course, and he stopped by to visit Ron, his brother, in the house where we were living. Of course, Don was living with Arthur Lee Allen's younger brother, Ron. That's how they met. So it's funny, Don's already throwing out there Riverside, and of course Sherry Jo Bates was murdered in Riverside. So at least Zodiac I believe was trying to take credit for Sherry Jo Bates' murder, even if he didn't commit it. But remember, back in the time that Sherry Jo Bates was murdered in 1966, you wouldn't have really heard about that up in the Bay Area because that happened near Los Angeles. Now, Don would, of course, had probably been aware of it because his in-laws still lived in Pomona, which is just next to Riverside, and his in-laws had lived there forever. I mean, all through the 50s and 60s, when Sherry Jo Bates was murdered, so he would have known about it. And, of course, the Sherry Jo Bates murder does not get tied in until later with Paul Avery and the Slow Boat to China letter, and everybody already knows most of the backstory on that. So, anyway, remember in this interview that Don Cheney claims he doesn't really know the Zodiac entire case that well, but he always throws out little things at you that tell you that he does. So that's interesting. He denies several times, I don't know it that well. I didn't want to read the book because I didn't want to seem like I was, I want my story about Allen to seem more, organic or something, that it wasn't influenced by what he read in a book. But then there'll be instances in this interview where he throws out knowledge that he does know it extremely well. And I know that he knows it well because you know the answer to that. And then here's the part where Tom Voigt asked, he's talking to Don Cheney about Arthur Lee Allen. He says, did he like hunting? Did he like to use a bow and arrow or a gun? And Don says, I don't know that he was ever into archery at all. We went with rifles during rifle season for deer, and he wasn't very good at that because he didn't walk well. Well, here's Don talking about how Arthur Lee Allen didn't walk well. So if he's really trying to just frame him, why wouldn't he, go in on everything, saying, him not walking well really pours a little dirt on it because there was a good walk involved at Lake Berryessa, of course. So talking about Arthur Lee Allen's bad feet is not helping Don's case in framing him. So anyway, Tom says, was that from his weight, his walking problems? And Don says, yes, his weight, and I think he was flat-footed. His feet bothered him with the extra weight, and he on some occasion was gouty. He had gout. So, or something like it, something that hurt him quite a bit. So, then again, there's something that doesn't help his case in framing him. So it's like Don doesn't want to go all in. He just wants to create enough doubt that it's Arthur Lee Allen. That's the whole thing that people need to understand. This isn't some hardcore frame the guy or anything else. It's just put enough doubt over there so we can enjoy this creation called the Zodiac Killer and what he did, and enjoy taking some credit for it. That's another thing you got to point to. If you read the Zodiac letters and you have no suspect in mind at all, and you just get a picture, if this is one killer and not a group, just think of the overriding thing. Because when you do read the letters and the thoughts in them, to me, definitely seemed like the mastermind of one person. You can kind of build who this is. And that person is not going to just do all this and walk away. They're either dead, or they're going to find a way to insert themselves back into this case to enjoy it somehow because they put all this work into it. They're not just going to go read the newspaper anymore and ride off into the sunset if they're still alive. That's my opinion, but that's what you get with the Zodiac. It's very egotistical. So here's another example of the feet again. Tom asked, did he ever wear any military clothing or Navy-type clothing? Because Arthur Lee Allen had a short stint in the Navy, of course. And Don said no. And then Tom says, how about shoes? And Don said that Arthur Lee Allen liked to wear sneakers and sandals. And Tom says, you never saw him wear like military type shoes. Of course, Tom Voigt's implying about the wing walker because the wing walker boot print was found at Lake Berryessa, and guaranteed Don knows this. But Don says, no, I don't remember what he wore for deer hunting. Well, that's kind of interesting that Tom's just asking what Arthur Lee Allen wore for shoes in general. And Don immediately refers that back to deer hunting, which I thought was odd. But it's also interesting that Don doesn't take the bait. He doesn't, why wouldn't he just say, yeah, he did. He wore wing walkers, and I remember they were size 10.5. He just doesn't go all in. It's because he's smart, and he just, remember, wants to create just enough of doubt that it was Arthur Lee Allen. He doesn't want to go all in on it because he wants the game to keep going. And it's so obvious in this interview, and he's basically tipping you off. But he's so smart that he's been getting away with this all along. And then here's another one I brought up in the very first video I ever did about Don Chaney. And this is when Tom says, so Lee was in the Navy. And Don says, he was in the Navy before I met him. Tom said, right. And did he ever talk about his experience in the Navy? And Don replies, no, only that he was a corpsman. And for some reason, they bounced him out. He was discharged. So there's Don talking about using that word bounced again. I mean, I guess I've heard that term bounced him out, meaning they got rid of him. But it's interesting that Don's used that at least one other time in an odd way. And that the Zodiac used that word in a weird way when he was talking about the little picking off the kitties as they come bouncing off of the bus. They weren't jumping or bounding. They were as they come bouncing off of the bus. So there's Don using that word bounced in kind of a strange way. And then he'll do it again somewhere else in this interview. And then a little ways after that part of the interview, this was interesting, I thought. Tom Voigt asked Don Chaney, he says, do you remember him in particular having any problems with police officers? Of course, talking about Arthur Lee Allen. And Don says, no, not while I knew him. He had told about the incident where he kicked somebody's door in and beat him up. Apparently that happened several years before. And he said, and Tom says, before you met him. And Don says, yeah, I didn't have any appreciation for the time element. I thought it was more recent than he was talking about. Of course, he's talking about the incident with Ralph Spinelli. I think that was, 1957, when Spinelli was still in high school. Of course, Allen was a little older. But if you go back and look at that, like I talked about at the beginning, that photo of Ralph Spinelli, he's a pretty big guy. He was on the football team. I don't really know how tall Spinelli is, but I think he's probably at least 5'11" or so. My money's on Spinelli. And here's, Chaney talking about how he beat the guy up. And I'm like, I don't know. My money's on Spinelli. I don't think Allen was ever in any documented fight. That's why this story is so bizarre. And, of course, that's all important because Spinelli will later tell about how Arthur Lee Allen came to visit him at one of his nightclubs and saying, hey, I think you're a stand-up guy for not prosecuting me for that incident, and I want to be a hitman for you, and all that nonsense. So that story makes no sense at all, but it's interesting that, Don has knowledge of it here, because I think Don somehow maybe knew Ralph Spinelli. And somebody asked me that before, if I knew if Don Chaney knew Ralph Spinelli. I have no idea. I'd love to. I suspect that he did, at least in some capacity. I mean, it's just too odd that whole thing with Spinelli comes up and Don is so familiar with it to bring it up. He's asked about problems with the police, and Don immediately recalls this story about Spinelli. And also recall, this interview was done about 7 years before the His Name Was Arthur Lee Allen video. And here's another part of the interview that I find really interesting, and this is when Tom Voigt is asking Don Chaney what types of music that Arthur Lee Allen liked. And Tom says, how about opera? And Don says he liked music. Tom says, like the Mikado or Gilbert and Sullivan type music, because, of course, the Zodiac Killer always mentioned the Mikado. And Don said, something like that, maybe. Tom said, nothing specific, though, that you remember? And Don says, I don't remember specifically what it was he liked, but I think he liked the symphony or opera. I did at the time. That is interesting that Don there inserts that he likes that type of stuff. And if I could have gone back in time, if I was Tom Voigt doing that interview, I really wished he would have said, did you specifically like the Mikado, Don? And if so, why? And where were you exposed to that? Because I think he was exposed to it, of course, in May of 1953 at Bakersfield College. So that's another interesting part. I think I'm going to go ahead and make this part 1 of 2. I'm going to do part 2 and do the rest of this interview, but I'm going to go ahead and get this uploaded so people can try to catch me over on Jerome's show on the French Wrecking Crew, and I'll have the link in this video if you happen to get this hopefully in the next hour, so you can go check it out over there. It's a live show, so if anybody has any questions, please put them on there. So I will get part 2 up in the next few days. Have a good week, everybody. Bye.